Hello and welcome. Today, we're diving into a really radical idea from the 19th century that honestly might be one of the most relevant things you hear all week. We're talking about Paul Lafargue's explosive essay, The Right to be Lazy.
So, let's just start with a question. We've all been told our entire lives that hard work is a virtue, right? That it's the key to everything. But what if that core belief, the very thing our society is built on, is actually a delusion? What if it's a strange madness that we've all caught?
And that right there is the core argument from Paul Lafargue. He wrote these words way back in 1883. He was claiming that our obsession with work is basically a self-inflicted wound, a furious passion that leads not to a good life, but to misery. It's a pretty shocking idea, so let's get right into it.
So, who is the guy who had the nerve to call our love of work a madness? Well, let's meet Paul Lafargue.
Lafargue was, a really fascinating character. Born in Cuba with a family tree that stretched across 4 continents, he was a true internationalist. He actually trained to be a doctor, but he pretty quickly became a radical socialist and activist. And here's the kicker. He married Laura, the daughter of the most famous socialist of all time, Karl Marx.
I mean, his life was this incredible journey. He meets Marx, literally joins the family, and then goes on to publish this legendary essay. But look at that final date. His life ended just as radically as he lived it, in a suicide pact with his wife Laura. They decided to end their lives before old age could get in the way of their commitment to the cause.
This was his final message to the world, a statement of just absolute, unwavering belief in the cause he'd fought for his entire life. It really tells you everything about the depth of his conviction, right up to the very end.
Okay, so what kind of world produces a thinker this radical? To really get his argument, you have to understand the brutal reality he was seeing every day. The 19th century factory.
16. Let that sink in for a second. That's how many hours were in a typical factory workday in France back then. And that wasn't for some special project. That was day in, day out. 16 hours.
And this wasn't just for grown men. An observer at the time, a Dr. Villermé, described the factories as a kind of living hell, especially for kids. He wrote about seeing these crowds of young children, pale, in rags, just covered in machine oil. And on top of their grueling shifts, they had to walk for miles to and from the factory. He basically said, this isn't work, it's torture.
And this slide just lays out Lafargue's point in the starkest terms possible. He pointed out that a so-called free factory worker in France had to work longer hours than an enslaved person in the Antilles, and way longer than a galley slave. All of a sudden, the so-called progress of the industrial age starts to look like a new, even more brutal kind of slavery.
So, faced with all this, what was Lafargue's big argument? He claimed the problem wasn't a lack of work, the problem was the work itself. And this brings us to the core of his economic case, what he called the paradox of plenty.
You see, he claimed that this love of work wasn't just bad for people's health. It was systematically wrecking the entire economy through this totally self-defeating cycle of overproduction.
Okay, so here's how he saw this crazy cycle playing out. First, workers are pushed to produce. Second, the market gets totally flooded with more stuff than people can actually buy. Third, because of this surplus, prices crash, factories shut down, and the whole economy just grinds to a halt. And here's the final tragic irony. The very workers who created all this wealth are now starving precisely because they produce too much.
And Lafargue wasn't the only one who saw this. He quoted an economist, Destutt de Tracy, who noticed this bizarre situation. The so-called rich industrial nations were creating widespread poverty for the people who lived in them. It was a system that generated huge amounts of wealth by creating huge amounts of misery.
So if work was the disease, what was the cure? This brings us to Lafargue's big solution, what he called the right to be lazy. Now it's time to figure out what he actually meant by that word. And this is the absolute key point. His idea of laziness isn't about sitting around doing nothing. For Lafargue, it was about reclaiming our time. It was about having the right to enjoy life, to pursue culture, to love, to feast, to just be human. He wanted to take the word laziness and turn it from a sin into a sacred right. So how much work did he think was actually necessary to keep society running? His proposal, which must have sounded completely insane in 1883, was a 3-hour workday.
And you might be asking, how is that even possible?
Well, the answer was technology. Lafargue argued that the very same machines that were brutalizing workers could, if we just organize things differently, become the source of their freedom. He believed technology's real purpose wasn't to make us work more, but to get rid of work altogether. Machines should serve us, not the other way around.
And to prove this wasn't some new, crazy idea, he reached all the way back to Aristotle. Even the ancient Greeks dreamed of a world where tools could do the work for us, freeing humanity from all that toil. Lafargue's point was simple. By the 19th century, that dream had finally become possible, but we had somehow chosen to turn it into a nightmare instead.
And that leaves us here. More than 140 years later, we're in the middle of an even bigger technological revolution, with AI and automation. We now have machines that can think, create, and produce on a scale Lafargue could have only dreamed of. So the question he asks is more urgent than it's ever been. Are we going to use all this power to work ourselves into the ground, or are we finally going to claim our right to be lazy?